I was at the BBC contracts department first of all, and then in the costume department. So two very different places.
Contracts.
Yeah, but I used to do overtime on That's Life, funnily enough. We used to go in the evenings to Lime Grove and open the mail, because everyone used to send mail in, you funny-shaped carrots and, odd-looking potatoes that looked like people's private parts. So I was one of them, and one of them in the evenings, because I lived in Shepherd's Bush as well, and Lime Grove was just along the road. But
I know by Lime Grove, in the first half of my period at the BBC, in the early 70s, That's Life was produced from Lime Grove. From Lime Grove, and the offices were there.
That's right, yeah. Newsnight was there as well, wasn't it? Newsnight and,
And then we had Nationwide.
Nationwide, God.
And then we had a club at the end of this. Well, That's Life was in the what were converted houses into a long...
Yes, I remember, yeah. There were converted houses just along from the big grey building that was Lime Grove.
That's right, yeah. Before it transferred to Kensington House. Do you know Betty, who used to do the reading?
Betty?
Maybe she was a little bit of a psychic. I only really knew her in Kensington House.
No, I don't really remember Betty. Not right. I mean, a long time ago for me now.
Ian, you say she was a psychic. Yeah. I mean, was this something that was on air or off air?
Off air. No, she was off air. She used to come in. Hobby was being a psychic, but she used to read through the mailbags full of letters, like the bent carrots and the complaints and so on.
I can't remember.
But I remember her from.
Betty.
This was in Kensington House. I do remember her from. In Lime Grove, it was a completely different setup because there were smaller rooms. There were people in different offices.
So was it at Lime Grove first and then on to Ken House, or was it at Ken House first and then moved to Lime Grove?
No, it was Lime Grove and then moved on to Ken House.
Now, I suppose I better introduce people because we're having a little chit-chat here. There's a couple of former BBC staff or freelancers, Nicola Wakeham, you can hear, and also Ian Hilpers. I wonder, Ian, maybe you could start off by just telling us how you found yourself working at the BBC and what sort of work you were doing.
Right, well, this is, I'm cutting a long story short, but I was happily working away in textiles. I finished my course at college to become a pattern weaver, and this was in the early 70s when we went into the EU, and then for no reason, and I made no connections, the textile mills, which were working 24/7, started to close down. Where at one time you could walk out of one job and get into another on the same day, but they were laying people off wholesale. And I couldn't see any future, so I thought, well, I'll do what some of my school friends did, which was to diversify. So I thought, well, some of my friends went into commerce, and I answered an advert in a local paper looking for insurance selling to students. And I thought, well, this sounds good, so I went for it. I was anticipating a basic salary and training and going to chat to students to sell them insurance. So I went along past the interview, and we ended up starting work, being driven to university campuses, staying in B&Bs and selling insurance to students, which we thought was great. And this went on for a couple of months. But we had no pay, as you would expect if you were working in a mill or a factory. We were classified as self-employed, and it was very smoothly orchestrated, and I didn't know I was being conned. And furthermore, I didn't know that the students were being sold the wrong type of insurance. My family background is that my stepfather had a wartime friend who lived in London, who worked for Liverpool in Victoria Insurance. So I phoned him for advice, and I said, look, we're selling whole life insurance policies to students, and we're not getting paid for it. And he explained to me what was going on, that it was the wrong type of insurance, and the insurance company insurance that should have been sold was sold by Ainsley, which was like the students' union. And when we didn't get paid, I got very, very angry. So, to cut a long story short, I took the story to the Sunday People in Manchester, and I also wrote to That's Life at the BBC. The BBC replied, and so I gave them information. I had copies of the training sales scripts and other information, and I passed it on to the researcher at the BBC. And I said, look, if you want any help. Now, my parents' friend lived in London, near Clapham. So I came down to stay, and I went to meet them at Lime Grove. And we put together the story. I backed it up with as much evidence as I can. And many months later, just before the next semester, That's Life transmitted basically my story, but more importantly, how students were being duped into being sold the wrong type of insurance.
I think, Ian, those were more sort of trusting days, weren't they? People weren't necessarily expecting there to be a scam. If you went along for a job, I think maybe nowadays people are much more suspicious when they're taking up a job as to whether they're going to get paid.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, in the north of England, where I was in Bradford in Yorkshire, you had a P45 in your national insurance card. You went to see the foreman, and if you liked it, he employed you. That's the way it was. But I thought I was entering into a world of white-collar workers, which was a different system, where the majority of people in industrial northern cities, that's all they knew. You get paid at the end of the week, you got a round little wage packet told you what your national insurance deductions was and what your net pay was.
So how did you go? How did you go from being an item on That's Life into actually working for them?
Now, this is the most bizarre thing ever, because in the run-up to the transmission of the story of That's Life, I got to know Henry Murray, who was on That's Life, and I met other colleagues like Norma Shepherd and a few of them. And of course, I met Esther Ranson and so on. And it was all exciting for me. I was staying in London. I was talking to people at the BBC, which I would have never have dreamed of. And then when it was transmitted on a Sunday evening, and this was a TV program that had 20 million viewers. It was vying at the top of the, if you like, the TV charts. For example, we were vying with Coronation Street and programs like that. And it was the top TV show. And I felt so proud. I felt so excited. And after the transmission, I was invited to the green room. And I just made an remark to Henry Murray. Oh, I would love to work in the BBC. I would love to work in television. And I had no real proper job up north anyway. So I went back to my digs and was ready to pack up to go home. And then I had a phone call from Henry Murray who said, would you like 2 weeks' work? And I said, yeah, sure. What do you want me to do? And he said, do what you've done before, which is be a salesman, go through the training course. And we went through the whole scenario of what I should do. And that was just to be me, a northern guy trying to find his way in the world. And I thought, okay, I'll do that. Money at the end of the day, at least is going to be honest. And I just went along. I had to go through finding the advert, responding to the advert in the Evening Standard. And then I was more or less given a desk, left alone, and then got an interview, and I got appointed to be a salesman. Another target of That's Life, which was selling orthopedic beds, which were advertising actively in the national and local press.
Okay, so they set you up as a sting operation, effectively. So you had gone in there pretending to be all innocent, but actually you were snooping around for a potential TV programme.
That's right, exactly right, yes. And I did a job. There was a little bit of an oddity there, though, because That's Life had already been tumbled with a previous researcher, as I believe, and the directors of the bedding company were also directors of a finance company that was providing this huge interest rate door-to-door sales operation with a fraudulent company.
So basically you were exposing these con men. But look, Ian, for youngsters who've never seen That's Life, can you just take us through what kind of programme it was?
Yes, That's Life was hugely popular, and it combined humour with serious stories. And it was a little bit light-hearted in one area, and then the headline of the East programme was a hard-hitting story of con men and beware. And it varied, but within all kinds of industries, for example, door-to-door selling with building improvements and so on. But he also had light-hearted things like favourite pets. And then it always had anecdotal comments by a guy called Cyril Fletcher, and then the two anchors were, in the beginning, were Kieran Prenderville and Glyn Worsnip. And it was anchored. But the programme was based originally on Braden's Week, which was a similar format, but Bernard Braden was sacked from the BBC for advertising Campbell's soup, which was out of favour of BBC presenters within the public eye selling soup. So Esther Ranson, who was a co-presenter on Bernard Braden, she took the leadership, and it was renamed from Braden's Week to That's Life. Now,
look, I might be wrong, but I think, didn't Richard Stilgoe used to do some sort of song on it as well?
He used to play the piano, didn't he? He'd play the piano and make up a little song.
That's right. Yeah, he had Stilgoe had cryptic songs to play, which was something to do with the content of the programme or some sort of cryptic songs which were made up at the time, fitting the programme. And a similar scenario happened when Victoria Wood was introduced onto That's Life. And the words were being made up just prior to production, and Victoria Wood, I didn't know Stilgoe, but I met Victoria Wood, and I would meet her with, like everyone else, and she'd be making the words up just before she would put this anecdotal song together and twinkle at pianos and make as in her style, and it worked.
Now, Nicola, you also did a bit of work on That's Life. Just what were you up to?
Oh, it was just literally to make a bit more money in the evenings. We used to go after we'd done our job in the costume department at 5 o'clock, or was it 5:30? I can't remember. We would go along to Lime Grove, and there'd be a little office there that they would send all the mail to. And we would just open the mail. There was tons of it, boxes and boxes of it. And there was probably about 6 of us that used to go through this mail. It was very, very funny.
And I think the thing is that you got so much mail, I suppose, it was actually fairly easy to find something funny in there to put on.
We'd have like 2 piles, because a lot of it was nonsense. And, nonsense and stuff that they might be interested in. So,
but it's a very different kind of BBC back in the 1970s. And but also, even though as a viewer, it was a kind of warmer, friendlier approach if you were watching the TV or listening to the radio than it is today. There was this sinister side, wasn't there? Because people like Jimmy Savile were able to sort of get to the very top of their profession. He was a major DJ on Radio 1. He used to do his Jim Will Fix It programme. He was a compere on Top of the Pops, where he was actually using the corporation. So did you ever actually come across him or anyone that was sort of knew Savile? Because that was kind of your era when you you were there.
Yeah. Well, we did because I worked in the costume in the first of all in the contracts department. One of my colleagues there, one of the contracts managers, would write out the contracts for Top of the Pops, and so he could get us tickets because us young girls, and we would go along to the television centre. Or he would put our names on the guest list.
So this was the place. This was the place to be every week, wasn't it, in London? Really?
Yeah, was it? I think it was Wednesday nights. Wednesday night was Top of the Pops. Yeah, and so we used to go along there, and Jimmy Savile was there. Doing his thing.
But I mean, were there rumours at the time, or how strong were they?
There were rumours.
I heard the rumours too.
Yeah. We didn't go anywhere near him because he was disgusting. I mean, he was just awful.
But you actually were in the same room as him.
We would go into the studio, and we would like dance on the edges because we didn't like to be seen because we were staff. We used to be around the edges just watching whichever pop star we wanted.
But when
to
you
see.
say he was awful, what do you mean?
He had there's a sort of really awful aura about him. I don't know what else to say. I mean, he looked awful. He looked hideous. He looked vile. And he was always, you would see him always groping the young girls and boys that he would take up to the front. He was always there with his arms round.
But surely you weren't the only person noticing this.
No. Everybody knew. We all knew he was disgusting, so we didn't go near him. But we knew everyone knew. And we used to, there's like a room off the main studio where the props guys used to sit, and they used to sit and laugh about how they were sort of disgusting old blokes themselves. They would laugh and say how Jimmy would ask them to pick out young girls or to send back to his dressing room after. But you didn't say anything. I mean, you'd have got the sack anyway if you'd have said anything, and I don't know.
The rest is history, really, isn't it? Because it was very strange that for me anyway, I find it is something incongruous about a friendly BBC on the screen, but actually behind the scenes it's a bit sinister.
Yeah.
Can I jump in there?
Sure. Yeah. Yes, Ian.
As you say, Nicola, when I was there, That's Life ran for 6 months, and the production staff used to go from programme to programme, and then on a series 2 or 3 when I was involved, the production staff would shift from Jim will Fix It to That's Life. And I couldn't type, and when I had my research report on a serious story, I would have Esther Ranson's PA and Jane or anyone who was available to take dictation from my research report to write it ready up for script. And in the chat in between, the gossip rumours, the BBC was full of gossip, but one thing that stood out with me, I mean, there was things like Esther Ranson and Desmond were working in general features together, which was against BBC rules for a start. And then there were rumours about who was doing who.
Okay.
And then there was this
Can you just clarify why?
Thing about
Ian, why is that against the rules?
I don't know.
You weren't allowed to work in the same department as your husband or wife because it was they were worried, or supposedly worried about sort of nepotism, So you couldn't.
That's right.
Yeah, you couldn't marry someone in the same department as you.
But anyway, Ian, you were coming to talk about the people that you knew who'd been working on Jim will Fix It.
Jim will Fix It, and they were saying and. I didn't think too much about it because there was different rumours about who was having an affair with who and so on. But constantly coming up was Jimmy Savile is a creep, and it was all in hushed.
Yeah.
It was all hushed. It was said to me, and I can quote Jane Wiley, production secretary, said to me, Jimmy Savile's a creep, and she said it in hushed tones. And I didn't ask her to elaborate. To me, he just seemed like a bit of a eccentric DJ I didn't know anything about his paedophilia, but for people to come up and say, oh, he's a bit of a creep and so on, maybe, just maybe, if I'd have looked into that even more closely, I could have found something out.
Yeah, and you probably have lost your job, actually, Ian.
Yeah.
But anyway, I mean, Ian, maybe you can you can say something about the way that the BBC has changed over the years. As someone that worked in the 1970s, 80s, behind the scenes, and you've obviously, like me, I mean, I worked in the early 1990s in radio. Seen the way it's changed, because nowadays it doesn't really seem to have that same warm, balanced feel. The sort of, in the old days it used to feel quite comfortable having your television in the living room in your own home. Nowadays, certainly I feel it's not really appropriate. A lot of the content that they have, a lot of the lies basically that are being told sometimes. I mean, we had the whole weapons of mass destruction lies being told day after day. And so how and why do you think it's changed so much?
Well, interestingly enough, at the time I had an understanding of the structure. Even though I was not a staff member, I was still involved in the structure to be paid at Cavendish Square and so on. So I was contracted out like many presenters and people are. But my job was just basically doing the research or being a reporter. In fact, I was actually challenged because I was so secret, even within the BBC, of how can a BBC, through the mailbox, like Nicola probably read a letter saying, I've been conned, it had to be turned by evidence into something that was transmittable. And I never, ever, ever, on anything that was transmitted, got sued or challenged in the court.
That's what we call in journalism. Standing up the story.
Exactly, and I always was absolutely dead level, and I wouldn't take any embellishment to make a story look more than it was. But that's life. Through other researchers, were often, several times, had to make out-of-court settlements to people that had been accused falsely of something, transmitted something wrongly, sued for defamation of character. But running back to the changes in the BBC, they had to check. They had checks and balances, and they wanted to know who I'd... So somebody from very high up in the BBC, from the Director General Office, came specifically to interview me because they were querying my pay for the stories I was paid and my expenses. So I just said, look, I'm here, I'm doing a job, this is who I work with, and I feed the BBC staff and the presenters, and at that time, Esther Ransom with the scripts. And I was meticulous to say, well, no, that wasn't right, yes, that was right, and there was no ambiguity. But the hierarchy, because I was learning about the hierarchy, it was always high tension. You would never find it in a tax office or Department of Transport or anywhere. But the television was high-wired. There was always people on edge about something.
Yeah, but Ian, what I'm trying to get at is how has the character of the organisation changed over the years, do you think?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm alluding, I think the potential of the character change was always there. It was always there, and knowing the people that I met, like Aubrey Singer and then Jacobs and all the other people, I always felt that there was the feeling of above hierarchical setup. And I never know was more true that when I transferred, my face was becoming well known in the face of the confidence strictures, Ideal Home. They were all there, the home improvements. So I went into radio training, and then I became a staff member in radio training. And there it was like a proper civil service organisation, glass ceiling, waiting to move into dead people's boots. And it was slow, so old-fashioned. But television, it was changing from a fluffy, as you said earlier, a fluffy organisation into something that was becoming more ambiguous. I sensed it, And in the late 70s, I was sensing it a bit more, but we still hadn't got to the wars on Iraq or anything.
Okay, well, maybe
in retrospect, I could see.
Let me ask the same sort of question to you, Nicola. What do you make of the changes, for instance, when you were actually working there?
Yeah.
Because you've got, anyone that's actually worked inside one of these mass media companies gets a bit more of an insight. When you're actually watching the TV or listening to the radio, you're also kind of looking behind it, aren't you, at the people making the programme?
Yeah, it was. I do think it was late 70s, early 80s when if I'm looking back now and I try to sense when it changed, I would have to say it started then. But I think that there was a whole sort of shift in the UK, because I remember being really shocked. Do you remember a department called Personnel Department? Well, I remember hearing that was going to be changed to Human Resources, and I thought, what are they talking about? Human resources, as if we're like just flesh that's useful to them rather than people. And they're kind
of equating you with money or something. Aren't they?
That's when I remembered the change, because I remember. While I was at the BBC, I used to have, my first car was a little Mini, and I think I sent you the photo of that. And do you remember they were using Minis for advertising? Maybe you're too young, but there was like a Levi's Mini that had a little zip up the front, and it was all done like a pair of jeans. Well, you could apply to have your Mini done with this, and so I did. Only by the time I got there, they'd changed from Levi's and they were advertising Durex. So it was.
You had a Durex Mini?
Yeah, I had a Durex Mini, and it was just dreadful, And I'd agreed to do it before I'd seen Durex, and it was nicely done. It had a racing car down either side, and it was called the Small Family Car.
So it sounds like you've been slightly conned there, actually.
Yeah, I know. But anyway, what happened was somebody from the Daily Mirror, or the Sunday Mirror, I can't remember, contacted me and said, could they come and take a photograph of me? And of course, I was only about 19, and I said, oh, don't put my name because I work at the BBC. And of course, that she put my full name and that I worked at the BBC. And the Monday morning afterwards, my name was like buzzing around the BBC, because apparently I was advertising, and my personnel officer called Val called me in. She was in
right, Nicola, we want a word with you.
Yeah. And so I went in all sheepishly, and she said, I am sick of the sound of your name. And she was actually really nice. I said, oh, I didn't know, And she said, well, you're just banned from all the BBC car parks. And I didn't get the sack.
Oh, good.
So that was lucky. But so it was kind of nicer then. But that's when the change began, I think, when personnel was called Human Resources, and we stopped being human beings.
Yeah, it's almost depersonalising the people, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, in the later years of that life, when we were at Kensington House, I did notice a change, and there were trickling through general features was this ethos of, well, we have to sharpen, and it was a change. It was changing from being Cyril Fletcher jokes and a serious story. And we got some heavy hitters in. The newly recruited from Oxford, Cambridge, we got in Peter Bazalgette and Adam Curtis, who were both sitting next to each other. And I did a couple of jobs with them. And these were the hard hitters. Peter Bazalgette is now chair of ITV. Adam Curtis is well known for his controversial documentaries on BBC with the Mayfair set and various other documentaries, which didn't go very far in respect of the conspiracies, but it was a taster too. And it's rather like Panorama. They always went a little bit controversial, but never went the full story. Or it was.
Well, hang on, because Alan Curtis, he did one called The Century of the Self, a series, another series called The Power of Nightmares, which is one of the best documentaries I've ever seen. So you were very lucky to be working with these people. He also did. I actually did a review of one of his last documentaries, and the documentary was called Bitter Lake.
Oh,
and that was about the very important meeting between Abdulaziz, the Saudi king, right at the end of the Second World War, along with President Truman. I think it was Truman, not Roosevelt. I'm pretty sure it was Truman. And that was where they agreed that the Americans were going to control the Middle East in exchange for all this oil money, and that the oil money would be used to fund this new form of Islam called Wahhabism. And this new form of Islam was going to be very violent, and it was going to be used to put down any Arab country which started looking like it might turn communist. And so, this Adam Curtis did a really good look at that, Ian. I mean, for me, if I can just chip in with my two halfpence here, for me, the big change, I worked in the corporation from 1989 to 1994, and that was the time I could see some big changes going on with something called producer choice they were bringing in. Of course, it had nothing to do with choice, because actually previous to producer choice, the corporation was like one big family. If you wanted to talk to an expert in any area, whether it be in one of the regions, a regional expert, or whether it be a particular subject, maybe through the reference library or news information in London, it was very easy. You just pick up the phone, you chat to whoever it is, you get your information, and you put it in your script for your program, whatever it is you're doing. Or quite often they would come on the line and you could record them and include them in the program or have them in live. It was an enormous... And what Producer Choice did is it said that if you were making a program and you wanted to include somebody, it all had to be signed for first through your producer and costed first. And you had to get permission up the sort of food chain to do it. Now, all I can remember in about 93, 94 is we used to just ignore the system and get on and do it anyway, because we knew that this bureaucracy was a way of kind of slowing everything down. And also around about 1987, I think it was the early 1987, Alistair Milne, the Director General, was sacked. He was doing programmes which were very against the Thatcher government as well as pro, but he was doing a counterbalance to Thatcherism. He did a programme about the IRA, I think it was called My Country, Right or Wrong, on the radio, which was giving a voice to the IRA people, which is supposed to be a terrible thing. Now, of course, nowadays we know that there were negotiations going on anyway, secret negotiations with the IRA. And also he did a really powerful program called Maggie's Militant Tendency.
Was this, can I butt in?
Panorama.
Was this the silk sinking of the Belgrano?
Actually, no, that's another one.
Oh, that's another one. Because she came in to make that program, and apparently Margaret Thatcher, she was so angry that she left. This is the rumours I heard. She walked out and decided that from then on she was going to break down the BBC as it was.
That's right. And she did.
She successfully.
She did.
I think we can all agree on that.
She demolished.
Yeah.
She demolished Thames TV.
As well. Yeah, that's right.
Handedly, she threatened and she said she was going to do it when Thames TV. Now, it's around the Thatcher era that killed off freedom of speech on TV, but it was long in the planning. My view of having left the BBC and gone into doing my own thing, I was watching these changes and I thought, what's going on here? This is not the BBC in balance. And has it progressed to now? But then I was looking, I've always been curious, like when I ever did any undercover work and we had to record it, I had to make a request to secretly record salesmen doing dodgy deals. And I had to go to the top, to the Director General's office. And I looked at that and I thought, well, let's have a look. In my period, I went through 3 Director Generals, and they all agreed to my work because it was exposing a con company. But when I was looking at the background to the Board of Governors, as it was, the trustees, and then looked at the structure, 4 of them were government employees. And that's where the influence came from. It was Thatcher's era, and then the 4 government employees were the ones that selected the rest of the trustees.
Yeah, it's
and
a very tiny number of people really controlling it, and they were all appointed by the government. I mean, just think about the era, 1987. I mean, it was the miners' strike had just happened. In the mid-80s, you'd had the hippie convoy being smashed up and beaten up, the Battle of the Beanfield. The peace convoy was destroyed. And maybe more importantly, you just had Wapping as well, where with the running battles in East London with the printers' unions and the triumph of Rupert Murdoch, who'd bought the Sun a bit before, and he'd also then bought the Times, and his new way of doing things was arriving on the scene. I think really the mid-80s was when a lot of changes happened, and really the last decent stuff that the BBC produced, really hard-hitting documentaries, apart from Adam Curtis. And it's worth saying, poor old Adam Curtis didn't even have his documentary Bitter Lake broadcast. It was only webcast. It was only available to watch on the BBC iPlayer. It wasn't ever actually put on the TV. Ian?
It came from the top. Now, knowing and chatting with Adam Curtis and Peter Bazalgette, who went on to do Breakfast TV and so on, but knowing these people, they were definitely within the upper echelons of university backgrounds, rich backgrounds. I researched into the background of Peter Bazalgette. I couldn't find very much out about Adam Curtis's background.
I think it's quite funny, you as a researcher, researching your own department, Ian.
Oh, well, this was afterwards, when things the penny started to drop a bit. And then, of course, people dispersed from the BBC because they were changing into smaller units and things were being franchised. And the BBC was creating, whether wholly owned or it was subcontracted out, to programme production.
Independent producers.
Independent, exactly. But then what I realised was people like Adam Curtis were commissioned but heavily edited. And like you say, and then some things were not transmitted. It always went to the edge but never fully quantified the true story.
Nicola, can I just ask you about what you make? Because, I mean, all this was in perfect place, wasn't it, when September the 11th happened? Yeah. What we had was a quite weakened BBC that weren't ever really going to ask any really serious questions about what was happening in the world. And, of course, a lot of people now look at this war on terror as a complete farce, but at the time, in 2001, 2002, whatever, people were supposed to believe it. Now, it starts to look as if, that maybe the war on terror might never have happened if the BBC had been tough and strong and taken it all on.
Yeah,
I mean, what do you make of this kind of post-9/11 era?
Well, I mean, the BBC is nothing but propaganda now. I mean, I just watch it occasionally because you just want to see what the enemy's up to, really. But I mean, I watch RT for any news. But funnily enough, I remember. I know what Ian's talking about, the changes, because during the mid-80s, I worked. They had at the BBC this thing called the Secretarial Reserve, where you if you were a secretary, they, rather than bring in temps from outside, they had their own secretaries that they would move around into vacancies. And I worked for a while on the Arena programme, and the editor of that was Alan Yentob. And it was while I was there that Alan Yentob became head of music and arts. And can I tell you how that happened? It was because the head of music and arts at the time for years had been this bloke called Richard Somerset-Ward. And there was this real hoo-ha going on one day. And apparently his secretary had complained that he had tried to spank her. And she was like a a temp from New Zealand, and so she wasn't going to take any of the nonsense that us, BBC temps would have done. But so it was at that point that Alan Yentob then became head of music and arts, and then very swiftly from there he became the Director General, didn't he?
Well, so, he was also instrumental in the lottery, wasn't he? Bringing the National Lottery onto the TV. But what about the ability, the journalistic ability to interrogate events? I mean, we're talking about, things like Manchester bombing, all these sorts of things. I mean, I look at things like that and I think, well, hang on a minute, here is somebody that is reported to the anti-terrorist hotline that then goes on and causes a major terrorist attack, but there never seems to be any real criticism of the secret services.
Because I think what happened was when this change happened, they would bring in people from Oxford and Cambridge. So people from the establishment would then go and work at the BBC and get the top jobs and become the editors. And so, they stopped all the real, like yourself, the real investigators, the people that would look into things, were either got rid of or silenced. So that's...
I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
What do you make, Ian? What do you make of this post-9/11 war on terror BBC?
Well, it was creeping up a little bit. I noticed when they were making documentaries about the justification for the Vietnam War and so on, and then even pre-9/11, we were being warmed up by the BBC. We had a panorama special a year before with a panorama special with Peter Power, a few others, who were talking about the scenario of who should control the media in case of such an event.
That's right. You're talking
right.
about
7/7.
the 7/7 just before the London bombings. That's right. Yeah.
I mean, how bizarre is that?
But
really?
that was preemptive, and I thought how close it all was to the reality. Now, leading up to 9/11, there was a couple of documentaries which I haven't found anywhere on YouTube or anywhere, was how dilapidated the buildings were, how the asbestos was
full of asbestos. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, there was the documentaries. So there was this softening up process, and then there was the what if the terror, and then there was a documentary with references to Al Qaeda. So the psychological opera was already in process within the BBC through the 90s.
Now, I mean, I can remember, just to interrupt you quickly, Ian, is just before the night of Diana's dying, Princess Diana over in Paris, the BBC, now this is in a Guardian article which was printed a day or two after the Diana death or assassination, or whatever you want to call it, the BBC had run just like literally a day or two before Diana, had run a mock-up of the death of a royal, actually at the corporation. That was in The Guardian a couple of days afterwards.
We've been primed, and it obviously softens the blow when it happens. I mean, it transcends the BBC, because what the BBC does, which is a state-run industry, it's a corporation which is controlled by the Crown, but the spin-offs are ITV and Sky, because they all sing from the same song sheet.
I'm going to ask you now also, Nicola, as someone with a little bit of nous that's worked in the corporation, what message have you got for the listeners about how to figure out whether we're being lied to or not? I mean, we all try to look between the lines nowadays, don't we? A bit like we were told that the Soviet Union used to be like this, But is there any way that we can figure out when we're being lied to and when we're not?
Well, you just get a sense of it once you first see, because, I mean, how did the BBC News find out 20 minutes before Building 7 collapsed that it was going to collapse? 20 minutes before. Yeah. I mean, who told them? Who gave them that information? Why don't, surely whoever gave them that information must have had foreknowledge, and there must have been complicit in it. So, you know...
Well, they should probably be arrested.
Itself, yeah, absolutely.
That's a crime, isn't it? Blowing up a building, bringing it down.
And I mean, it just fell straight down into its own footprint. I'm sure you've seen that many times, that you know, that it was brought down by explosives, clearly.
So how do...
I can help answer that.
Yeah.
BBC, news, wherever they are, take the news. If you see someone live on a location of an event, they are still getting the news through the wires of Reuters and Associated Press. And of course, the delay of the demise of Tower 7 was delayed. It didn't go up when it was supposed to go up. And that is evidence, if you search the trolls of videos which have never been transmitted, of a mysterious Mr. Bennett, a reporter runs up the very dusty covered dark escalator and he confronts Mr. Bennett, who is Secret Service, and there was some delay. And of course, the wires got crossed between the actuality and the press.
So look, let me ask you the same question, Ian. I mean, when you're watching TV now, when we're watching events take place via the TV screen, a lot of it, like you say, is coming through the wire services like Reuters, Associated Press, people like that, and then the BBC people. I mean, in Greater London Radio, we used to have the Reuters feed, and we would be reading straight off Reuters right onto the news bulletins.
Rip and read.
And that's it, rip and read. Very good. Yeah, you've done it too. And how do we tell nowadays when we're being lied to or not?
Well, number one, almost every terror attack that's happened in the West, Paris, Brussels, and so on, is a false flag. Every single one.
Give us an example. What do you mean by that?
Well, number one, as soon as I heard about the Paris truck attack in Nice, my first thing is to hit the record button on my Digibox. When you get the eyewitness reports, I Google it to see who is this. The guy who filmed a truck for no reason at all before he had hit, allegedly, anyone. You see his camera tracking the anonymous white truck, and then, of course, it's allegedly killed 80 people. And then I Googled his name, and I found him to be a head of the Zionist movement at Cambridge University. So diligence, don't switch on your TV, look at it critically, and then think about the possibilities. Then, to follow up from that, I saw mobile phone footage of the alleged victims. Now, I've seen one person being killed by a truck, and it's very, very unpleasant. It tears a body apart. When you look at the aftermath of the 80 people that this truck was meant to, there's no blood on the road. There's no tents hiding dead bodies. It's piecing it together. And so record everything on any event that happens, and you can almost immediately dissect it, because sometimes they make errors and then they're never repeated in the news bulletins later.
Okay, so your rule is make sure you hit play and record or whatever it is when one of these things happens.
Hit record. But the other thing is, other people do it as well, like piecing together 9/11.
What do you think, Ian? What do you think the ultimate agenda here is?
Well, of course, it's obviously the shadow government, which is often alleged by David Icke and people like that, and many, many others are awakening to the idea that there is a group of people, families, who are controlling the world. The governments are puppets. They own the media. Now, I'll give you an example. I did a company's health check on ITV. I looked at Sky. They are 80% owned by offshore, tax-free, private investors.
So, Ian, are these the people that we call the 0.1% that own more than 50% of the world's wealth? Are that yes. The people?
Those are the people, and I can name them: the Sinclairs, the Windsors, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and then there's people that are totally in the shadows, but they are head of corporations. And if you look at any big corporation that's swallowing up everybody else. They've got limitless amount of fiat currency and also tax-free profits.
So what do they want? What do they want to do to us? What?
They want to own the world. They own 50% of the world. They want all of it.
And that means us as well, I suppose. Look, one thing I will say is when you're reading and watching, say there's a big event of some sort, just look for, is there any balance in the reporting? So you'll often find there's, I mean, particularly with two countries potentially involved in a battle, Britain and another country, or two separate countries. See if the reporters are giving you both sides. I mean, this is one of the things I've found since the 90s and late 80s, that we just simply not given, say, for example, on the Russian poisoning in Salisbury, we're not getting the actual Russian, what the Russians are saying. They're not even telling us what the Russians are saying. And that's one good way to know that you're being lied to and you're being propagandized, is when you only get one side of the argument. Anyway, I'm going to leave the last word politely to a lady, Nicola Wakeham. Nicola, what would you like to say finally about what lesson we can have today from our experience, all three ex-BBC people, on actually looking at stuff that's coming up on the screen in the future and how you can read it?
Yeah, I would say just don't waste your time by listening to BBC News, and unless you're watching RT and you want to see what they're up to. I mean, the Skripal stuff is just absolute nonsense. This military grade nerve agent Novichok that they've all recovered from, and where are they? Suddenly the story is gone, hasn't it? It's just disappeared. And you get it on RT. They're sort of saying, well, where are the Skripals? What have you done with them? And I do wonder, what do you think they've done with them? Are they dead?
Okay, no, I don't think so. Let me suggest. I know I'm supposed to leave the last word to you, but I think they've just been paid off. I mean, this is what MI6 do. This is what the foreign intelligence, but they could pay people loads of money and say, right, go away and keep quiet.
Yeah,
and,
possibly.
Here's some money.
But have they gone back to Russia? Would she have gone? She had family there. She's got a dog there, No,
they'll be over here somewhere, maybe in the English countryside, maybe in the States. Who knows? I think they just pay people off. Anyway. Yeah. I think we better wind things up. So you've been listening to me, Tony Gosling, and also to Nicola Wakeham and Ian Hilpus, both employees of the BBC back in the 1970s, 1980s. And I suppose we're all here really giving people, if we can, a bit of advice on how to see through the propaganda. So thank you very much, Ian and Nicola, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all for this week. Dialects, Bristol's first weekly podcast. You can download it to listen on your phone or in the car. Subscribe and listen the week before broadcast at dialectradio.co.uk. Thanks to our guests Nicola Wakeham and Ian Hilpus, who both worked on That's Life, amongst other things, BBC1 from 1973 to 1994, one of the longest running programmes at 21 years that was. Also to studio engineer Dave Bazanko. Dialects, a Bristol Broadband Co-op production, catches on Bristol Community FM 93.2 every Tuesday at noon, and anyone can contribute. Contact us at the People's Republic of Stokescroft, just off Jamaica Street. They're online at prsc.org.uk. You can talk to the PRSC office on 0117 909 6897 or the China shop on 944 4540. Volunteer with us if you like, or for hundreds of opportunities across Britain via the National Volunteering website, do-it.org. That was Dialect, and I'm Tony Gosling, wishing you a very good week. I'll be back on Friday with my 2-hour BCFM politics show, live from 6 to 8 p.m. Meanwhile, thanks for listening. Till the same time next week. Goodbye for now.